Currently, she offers classes and workshops for University Museum Studies programs, edits museum publications, and collaborates on projects contributing to social justice in the museum field. She's the founder of the Empathetic Museum project and is a member of both the Museums and Race and Mass Action initiatives. He also blogs at museumcommons.com. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today, Gretchen. We're going to focus on what it means for a museum to be empathetic and how institutional empathy aligns with overcoming systemic racism, including expanding diversity and equality, and becoming anti-racist. Before we begin, I want to ask you a question, Gretchen, that comes from the CAM program committee. We intentionally created the title for this series, ReMuseum, which could be interpreted in multiple ways, as Tomoko alluded to. If you could create a definition for the word ReMuseum, what would you say?
Well, first, I just want to say good afternoon to everyone from rainy, cloudy Washington, D.C., and thank you to the California Association of Museums for inviting me. I think that ReMuseum is a great overall title for this series because the prefix re has, as an editor, I would say that the prefix re has just so many possibilities. And as I began to think about it, I decided that reboot would be my synonym. And the reason is that I think I've had experiences, a couple of kinds of experiences with rebooting. One is that you have a kind of a glitch or something in your computer, and so you just shut it down and turn it back on, and then it comes back pretty much the same way as it always was. Or you might have downloaded some new software or a new program, so then you have to shut it off, and when you turn it back on, you have brand new content. You have something really new and different on your laptop or your computer. And so to extend this metaphor, I think that the shutdown has been our reboot. The fact that museums have had to remain closed for many, many months and are just now beginning to reopen in a gradual way. And what I have found, and this is based on conversations that I'm having currently and have had with museum professionals of my own generation, but also younger museum professionals and certainly many professionals of color. And what I would say is, I think that so far, for many museums, the shutdown has been the first kind of reboot, in the sense that everyone went to digital, but basically was trying to do as much as they could digitally, the same as they did already with exhibitions or programs. And in my view, and in the view of many people that I've talked to, the second kind of reboot, where coming back means coming back in quite a new way, in terms of structure and purpose, we're not seeing as much of that happening with museums, and maybe there'll be some questions and discussion about this afterwards. But for example, a number of museum educators that I've spoken with have wondered why, given the impact on schools of the pandemic and the shutdown, and given the kind of powerhouse in terms of educational skills and knowledge museums are, why there haven't been more collaborations between museums and schools, or offerings of the services, the large spaces, the well-ventilated spaces that many museums have, that might have helped schools and education generally in many of the difficulties that it's facing. Certainly, I have seen some museums, for example, the Oakland Museum in Berkeley, that's, I think, physically near to a number of you. From what I understand from their staff, they really are using this time to reconsider and reflect, and they're digging down into their museum culture, their structure, and really working to make some changes. You have someplace like the Queens Museum in New York, where during the shutdown, and particularly because the Queens Museum had community partners, they opened a food pantry because they saw that as a primary need for people in that community, serving hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lunches and meals every day. And it's interesting that the Queens Museum has just opened, but they've decided to continue the food pantry services because they see that this is a continuing need in the community. And just a couple other things with regard to assessing systemic racism during this period of reboot. What we found is that museums, for example, many museums did speak out after the murder of George Floyd in late May. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later on in the presentation. But many museums produced statements against racism and against the killing of George Floyd, but not as many actually connected their own work with systemic racism. And it seems to many of us who are working in this area that this is a very important time to do kind of what we're doing today, actually, which is reflect a little bit on systemic racism in museums and see if there are ways that we can counteract that. So I guess my use of the term reboot is, what I feel right now is that there's still time because this reboot is taking longer than any of us anticipated, and that the world that we come out in once all shutdowns are over really is going to be a very different world than the one that we left in March. And I feel that museums really are going to have to be thinking about themselves differently in order to serve that world.
Thank you, Gretchen. I think you've really encapsulated what we had in mind when we chose ReMuseum as the title for this series. You've given us several words to consider. I like reboot because I'm a technologist too, and see that as restarting on a clean slate with a maybe new and different environment. I like reconsider, I like reflect, and I think all of us can take something away from what you've just told us as your view of the word ReMuseum. Now let's talk a little bit about the Empathetic Museum. How did you come to be involved in this? Who participates? What are the main goals? Give us the broad strokes of the Empathetic.
Okay, I'll try. Really, I began writing and thinking about the Empathetic Museum on my Museum Commons blog probably in 2012. I started the blog in 2011. And in 2012, I noticed a huge difference in the ways that libraries and museums responded to Hurricane Sandy in the Northeast corridor of the United States. Libraries, I was following the New York Public Library on Twitter, and almost immediately they were tweeting, many of our branches are closed, but as soon as electricity comes on, we're open. If you live in the neighborhood, come in. You can get warm here. You can recharge your devices. You can get water. People were without heat. They were without many amenities. And it's not the role of a library, to provide shelter and water, but the library system in New York, anyway, really took it upon itself to see what the needs of the neighborhoods were, and then they responded. They even forgave overdue library loans, which I thought was a special kind of empathy. And then between 2012 and 2014, during the time that we had many murders of unarmed Black men, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, I began to see that the social media of mainstream museums, I was on Twitter and I was following museum people as well as many others, and I saw that in my Twitter world, my museum Twitter world, it was as if Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice did not even exist. Really, nobody was talking about this, whereas 24/7 on the news and everywhere else, there was a national discussion on race. And what I began to see was that the only museum organizations or people particular organizations that were talking about these killings and police violence were those led by African American museum colleagues, like the African American Museums Association or the Missouri History Museum, where the education department was led by Melanie Adams. And I think I saw that she spoke earlier in this series, and she created a huge program at that time on the day of the funeral of Michael Brown. So I started to think, what's the difference between the indifference of white-led institutions and the attention and concern of Black-led institutions? And the word that came to me was empathy, that there was this resonance. And you might say, well, yes, that would be understandable because it's their boys that are being killed. But that kind of begs the question, because if we're only thinking of this as their issue or their sons, if we all are not thinking of these young men and young women as our children, our sons, our brothers, then no wonder we are giving off an air of indifference and lack of resonance. And so I began thinking about the idea that institutions can show empathy and concern as institutions, not just as individuals. And that's when I began to think a little bit more about what the characteristics of those would be, of empathetic actions and policies. What would those be? And then we developed a maturity model, which I think you'll see on the screen shortly, that kind of mapped out those characteristics. So the goal of the Empathetic Museum is to try to help and encourage museums to look at their own ways of responding to the world and thinking about how they can improve those in 5 main areas. Right now, there are about 9 of us who belong to the Empathetic Museum. Most are consultants and do lots of things, including workshops for the Empathetic Museum. And a few of us are, a few people, not myself, but a few people are employed in museums. We're multi-generational. We have a member from Mexico. We have a member from Canada. We are multiracial and multi-ethnic in our makeup. And we offer workshops and advice to museums that are seeking to transform themselves institutionally.
So in your work with the Empathetic Museum, you've developed this maturity model, which can help museums move toward a more empathetic future. And everyone can see on the screen what these 5 characteristics are. What impressed me about these categories is that each one focuses on actions that we can all take to get involved to help our museums overcome systemic racism. So if we take a closer look at perhaps civic vision, the first one on the list here, Gretchen, can you give us some examples of well-developed civic visions and maybe 1 or 2 that aren't so well-developed?
Sure. And I would say that this is an abbreviated model because it makes a better slide. The actual maturity model covers the front and back of a page because each of the categories has a number of suggestions. So, and you can download that by going to www.empatheticmuseum.com, and then you can find the maturity model in English, in Spanish, and we shortly will have a French version up as well. So just know that this one is much shorter and much simpler and less complex, but a little bit easier to see. So, for example, civic vision. Many of you probably know the work of Gail Dexter Lord, and she and a woman named Ingari Blankenberg wrote a book a few years ago called Museums and Soft Power. And in that, they talked about museums being anchor institutions that they felt that museums, instead of pushing a specific brand as they have been, maybe earlier in the 21st century, that many museums are seeing themselves as part of the civic infrastructure. So when you look at a community, you look at, does it have good hospitals? What about the school system? What about the arts? And museums and libraries are a part of that civic infrastructure. And so what we felt was museums need to have the vision and the imagination. Even if you're a small museum in a small town, you are part of what makes that community a great place to live. And your director should have some connections with, for example, the mayor and the city council. And those of you that work in the education department should know quite a lot about the school system and have contacts there. So the idea that a museum is embedded in its community, and for example, the Boston Children's Museum at the time of the marathon bombings in I think it was 2013. I talked with people at the museum after the marathon bombings during the Boston Marathon races. And I said, how did you respond? And they said, well, we've felt a part of the community for a long time. And so we have contacts in the mayor's office and on the city council, and we contacted them and said, is there something that we can do? And one of the things they said was, could you draft a statement that we could read on radio stations that would help parents understand how they could talk about this with young children? And so the museum did that. And they also learned that the children who had been injured had all been taken to one hospital, and they were looking for activities and things that the children could do. So the Children's Museum prepared packets that were sent over to the museum. So this comes out of a sense and a sustained sense, a built-up sense of being part of the community, so that when something like this happens, we have timeliness and sustainability as another characteristic. The museum can step in. They know who to call and how to make connections. And I would say a lack of civic vision is what I mentioned with regard to museums and Hurricane Sandy, where I found, I think, one museum in Long Island that sent out some of the same messages as libraries. We're here. Our heat is on, our electricity is on, come in, get water. But most of the other museums really, I think, missed an opportunity once they had checked that their own facility was safe and that the collections were safe. Of course, this was their first responsibility. But then afterwards, I kept looking for museums that maybe opened to the neighborhood, or maybe made their educators available. Parents and children were trapped at home for weeks. Couldn't museums have been a free place for people to bring their children? It just seemed to me that there were a lot of areas that museums really missed an opportunity to show that they cared about the everyday situation of the communities around them.
I offered the Getty Center as an example of that kind of action during the recent fires over the last few years that have affected the area where the Getty Center is located. Although the center couldn't be open for public use, they were the command post for the fire department.
Yeah, that's great.
Come and eat and sleep and wash and refresh themselves to go back out on the fire lines. Another example of thinking about the larger community.
Right.
Moving on, I think we're familiar with the concept of body language as it applies to ourselves personally. But what does it mean for an institution to have body language? Can you help us understand how a museum's institutional body language may reveal its systemic racism?
Yeah, I think this seems to be something that people grasp fairly quickly. And just a very quick example is a few years ago, there was a notice that Harvard University had received a huge grant for studying systemic poverty. And at the same time, their workers in their cafeteria were striking because of low pay. So this is kind of an example of two faces of the same institution. Another example would be plantations or historic houses that where the owner was originally the owner of enslaved people. And these places continue to hold weddings and debutante balls and so forth. And they don't really tell the full story of who the owner was, what the history of the house or the plantation was. There's a disconnect between the best practice of telling the history of your organization and the way in which it is used, and what message that conveys to the parts of your population that don't have ancestors that had debutante balls or wore hoop skirts and that kind of thing. So I think those are examples. Another current example would be, as I mentioned, and many of you probably were involved in this, and it's a good thing. For example, in 2014, very, very few museums in the country felt compelled at all to say anything about Ferguson or about any of the police killings, and many specifically told their employees who were on Twitter, "You can't use the museum name. This is not our issue." This time in May of 2020, of the 1,088 museums that are accredited by AAM, Mass Action, Museums as Sites for Social Action, looked at the websites of all over 1,000 and found that over 500 did feel an obligation to make some kind of a statement about the death of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, systemic racism, and so forth. So that's a huge step in the right direction, that museums even saw this as part of their mission. However, Mass Action is continuing to study and look at these statements. And what we have found, and we're going to be publishing our research on this, we've created a spreadsheet, and we're looking using several criteria. We're looking at the statements. And what we're generally finding is that most museums, and this happened also with a lot of organizations like
Have we lost Gretchen's audio?
anymore. It's saying my internet connection unstable. I guess I could try tuning in with my phone. Are you not hearing me at all?
So now we hear you again. We lost the last bit of what you were just saying.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sometimes
okay. Well,
if you turn off your video, yeah.
Okay, I will turn off my video. So I think that many institutions decried racism in society, but they did not see themselves as connected to the structural racism that exists in society. And so that Mass Action is going to be doing is publishing a report where we analyze different statements by museums and other cultural institutions to see, do they decry not only racism in general or racism in museums, do they see some connection between their own practice and structural racism? A good example of a museum or an institution that did this, the arc in a southern state, that said on a statement that they to record history and keep the archives of the Confederacy. And for that reason, for much of their history, they did not collect any history related to African Americans in their state. They acknowledged that that was wrong, and they now are collecting the history of everyone in the state. But in that way, they were able to connect their own practice with the history of systemic racism in their state.
Thank you. I think everyone probably caught that, and if not, we can hear the closed captioning, perhaps watch it in the recording if you've missed some of what just transpired. Gretchen, before we open up questions from our audience, is there anything else you'd like to share with us about the Empathetic Museum and the fight to dismantle systemic racism?
Yeah, I think there's one in that. This something that I particularly gained from reading How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. And that is that he looks at racism itself as a system. Certainly there are individual racists, but the power of racism comes because it is a system. It inhabits our laws, it inhabits our cultural institutions, inhabits our educational system. It's part of how Oscars are awarded, for example. You know, racism is very much a part of our whole society. And so he feels that the only way to really address it is to address it systemically. And I think what that means for those of us who are white is that while we ourselves might think of ourselves as very tolerant, that we don't use racial slurs, that we that we feel that we're very open and we try to treat everyone equally. The question is, to what extent do we participate in systems that perpetuate white people coming out on top, whether it's an all-white board or no diverse leadership in a museum. All of the administration is white. The collections are white and male. The programming, you could have a whole series of programs, not a single person of color or maybe one person of color is featured in a series of 5 or 6, very substantive programs. What kind of a message does that send in terms of the expertise? Are only white people expert in this area? So I think that's the area where museums have to work. To what extent do our systems that are very standard practice in most museums, to what extent do they uphold white supremacy and exclude women, people of color, LGBTQ communities from being fully participative in what we do? And I feel that because the Empathetic Museum addresses systemic change, that it can be a guide to looking at both the history and the current practice of a museum on a variety of levels, of systemic levels, and can help a museum move from a regressive situation through a planned and proactive stance of inclusion.
Thank you. You've certainly given us a lot to think about. I want to now open the discussion to all of our attendees. You're welcome to turn on your video and unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question, or if you'd feel more comfortable, you can type your question into the chat box and Leigh will pose a question for you. To begin, Leigh has a question that speaks to what many of you are probably thinking right now. Leigh?
Yes, hi Gretchen, hi, and thank you, Ruth. So I'm working at a small museum, but I'm also a small museum that's a university museum, so it's a small cog in a big wheel. And I think a lot of the audience may speak to one or other part of that, where they as staff may feel like small cog in a big wheel, or maybe at a small museum themselves. What recommendations do you have to start the work toward becoming an empathetic institution?
Well, I actually think that it could be easier at a small institution, because for one thing, you have fewer people and probably fewer systems to look at. So I think that size is not a particularly relevant factor in becoming more or less empathetic. I guess what I think are important factors are, I do think that this is something that if it's not supported by the upper administration, it's not going to get very far. I find often that the people that are most interested in questions of diversity are often the visitor-facing people, you know, the visitor services or the educators, but often they don't hold as much power as the curators or the director and so forth. So getting your director and curators on board by sitting down with them, for example, maybe looking at the rubric with them together and using it as a kind of an assessment tool, you know, and maybe looking at something, for example, the response of the museum to the death of George Floyd, and then all of the racial conversations that were happening across the country. Let's look at how we responded to that. Do we fall into the regressive category? Did we see ourselves as having a place to say something, or did we feel that it didn't matter if we said anything? You know, did we feel that what we did say was just window dressing, or did it really authentically represent an intention to change in our practices, to look at our hiring, to look at our board composition, to look at how we plan and choose these stories that we tell? So if you can use the rubric to kind of assess and evaluate, then, and get some of the senior administrators on board, then I think you can perhaps begin moving to change the practice. And you know, it's not easy. I think it could take months and months. Even if you look at the statements that museums have made since May, many of those have shifted. I mean, that's one of the things that we're looking at as we're examining these statements. They put up, they were taken down, they were revised. And I think all of this is a work in practice, and it can be messy and it can create uncomfortable conversations, but it's something that simply has to be done if museums really are going to resonate with the full range of people that they want to serve.
Gretchen, your voice is coming in stronger now. You might want to try turning on your video again.
Oh, okay. I'll see if I, you know, and then you can just tell me
you fade away.
If that, okay.
That helps the connection, I think.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah. So we had one come in with registration, which is, it's kind of a long question, so I'll ask it, and if we need to just circle back to parts, that's fine. How do museums remain accountable? Does the museum field need a more rigorous accreditation process? Do we need an ombudsperson? Do we need clear guidelines, clear guidelines for deaccessioning exist, but not for staffing equity or genuine commitment for diversifying audiences? Can this be regulated?
I think that it can be, and I have noticed that too, that I worked as an several accreditation panels, and it seems to me that the focus is much more on collections and to some extent maybe traditional educational practices. But you know, and this is where, in all honesty, AAM has made a big effort in looking at DEAI, you know, diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. And they've published a book on it, and they have definitions and so forth. If that isn't worked into their accreditation criteria, this is a good example of kind of a institutional body language that is askew. You know, that if DEAI is that important, it ought to be embedded in accreditation. It oughtn't to be a kind of an option. So I think this is an area where AAM needs some work. They have hired a really good man, Andrew Plumley, who is now a director of diversity, and he may be working on just this kind of thing. I think he's published some blogs on the site, and you can find his name, on AAM site, and you might want to just reach out to him and ask him what he thinks about this question, and whether AAM is moving to put DEAI into accreditation.
That's great, thank you. So a question just came in the chat. Jennifer, if you want to ask it live, feel free to turn on your mic or your video. I'll wait 1 second just to be sure.
Sure, can you hear me?
Okay.
Yes.
Go for it.
Hi, Gretchen. I'm in
Hi.
Sacramento. I work with Cam, and my question was actually what you mentioned earlier about the schools, and I just curious to what extent, or what you would ascribe as the reason that museums haven't really been engaged meaningfully as alternative school sites during the pandemic, and is it too late? And how would you recommend pursuing such service?
I think one reason is, and this is something right after everybody closed down, a woman named Michelle Moon, she's on Twitter, you can find her, she started a spreadsheet tracking layoffs and furloughs, and she asked museums to report in, and she began getting hundreds and hundreds of entries into her spreadsheet. And of course, one of the big things is that the lowest paid and most temporary or contract workers are in the front-facing staff. They're the education people, they're the visitor services people. So the very people who might have the expertise and the enthusiasm, and the staff of education departments are really the ones that are connected with schools. They love kids and working with teachers and all that. In many, many cases, those are the people who were let go. Curators and collections people, were directors. They might have taken a salary cut, but they weren't furloughed or let go. So I do think that that's one big reason, is that there wasn't a rethinking of, wait a second, is there some way we could keep these folks on and utilize them in this new situation? And then I don't know, I think maybe, certainly you can't blame, everyone was upended. I think everyone was puzzled. Everyone was, in a way, and there were many financial issues that directors and so forth had to address. But I don't know that we have an answer. A lot of people that I've been talking to who are retired museum educators, for example, we're all thinking, what happened here? It just seems, and I don't know that it's too late. I think that given the fact that many places are still either having combined, or they're still having virtual classes, the education department reaching out to the local school system and saying, can you think of any way we might collaborate, in terms of space, in terms of personnel, help on Zoom, and I think that would be so appreciated by the school system, and it would be an example of empathy. Here's our local museums have the civic vision to think of this, have the community resonance, and they're really interested in what happens with our kids. So it's a great question, and I don't really have a complete answer.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Thanks, Jennifer. Are there other questions in the group? Otherwise, I have ones I can throw out, but I'd rather hear from other people personally.
I have a question, and I'm not quite sure how to ask it, but it does seem like when you're looking at systems in museums that one of the primary issues is that so many of us are funded by individual donors. Like the bulk of our revenue comes from individual donors, which already bakes in inequity in terms of, the pay to play dynamic and trying to get both you know, the emphasis of the institution to focus on the community. When you talk about what community do you serve, it's often that donor community rather than.
Right.
So I'm just wondering how to shift that conversation.
I think that's a really good question. And I know of some museum colleagues that are working now on, developing some workshops for museums. And one of the things they're going to be looking at is retooling the financial planning, the way how museums are funded. The model itself, as you've suggested in your question, is not a very healthy model, and it really falls apart in something, in something like this. The other thing too is that a lot of people will say, well, if we bring up, questions of diversity, I mean, are all white, we're going to lose some funders. Number one, I think a lot of foundation type funders are more and more looking for evidence of community service and community. I mean, that's one of their criteria for giving money. I also know of a couple organizations, the Eastern Penitentiary, which in the last few years kind of switched from being just kind of like an old jail where they had, they had artist installations in some of the cells, and they had Al Capone stayed there for a while, and they were kind of emphasizing the unusual, and they began to think about the fact that this was a place of incarceration for 100 years, and they did a big exhibition on mass incarceration, basically they took a position against mass incarceration, and they also began hiring formerly incarcerated people as docents. And they rewrote their mission statement to acknowledge the fact that they were a place of incarceration and had been. And they did lose some funders, but they also picked up others who saw this as, as something that was really positive. And the same thing happened at the Abbey Museum in Maine, which was a museum mainly a collection of white people of the material goods of the Native Americans who live in that area of Maine. And there were no Native people on the board. It was all white people. And the new director, then new director, Cinnamon Catlin Legutko, came in a few years ago, and you can find her writings and you can find information, but she really began to shift the board to look at the whole concept of decolonization, to make sure that that board had Native members. And again, they lost donors, but they also picked up donors. So I think that, and this is the time, I think, this would be the time maybe to start considering things like that and reading about museums that have made that change and what challenges they face, but also how they've been able to succeed. And they had a lot of pushback. I know that at the Abbey Museum, it's ABBE, at that museum, there were some contentious board meetings, but over many months, they were able to shift the perspective of that museum.
That's great. I'm going to read a couple comments just to make sure it gets into our recording, because I don't know if the chat shows up. So Celeste from, of course, our leader at CAM had commented that the fleet in San Diego, the Science Center, has been serving as a hub to support school children and provide childcare on a weekly basis. And so she wanted to know if anyone in the webinar knows of other organizations in California doing this, or I guess elsewhere too. And then there's an observation that's a really powerful one from Chris. Chris, did you want to jump on microphone and talk about this a bit? Just waiting a second to see.
Hi, everyone. So I've wrote that as we speak of changing the system in favor of empathy, I think we need to address arbitrary status hierarchy. We've been told that curators and directors and scholars have a higher status, and we've believed it. And we continue to endorse those systems. When many educators have similar credentials career paths, experiences, when many other professional visitor service directors and managers have come into a field from very wealth of experiences and deserve to be recognized in those ways, or not be first in the chopping block just because there are other considerations. So I think we all need to have feel that we have a little bit of agency and argue for that change of arbitrary status hierarchy, because it is arbitrary.
I think that's a great observation, Chris, and just relevant to that. I don't know if any of you have read or heard about the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote The Warmth of Other Suns, but she analyzes, she uses the word caste rather than race in looking at systemic issues in the United States. And she really feels like caste is like the skeleton on which the flesh of racism and other inequities is lack of gender equity, that the bones of all of that is caste. And, and I think caste maps very well into the museum culture, because there is a lot about museums that are, especially I think art museums, where that is associated with more privileged people, less privileged people, the donors, the founders, the docents perhaps are from the more privileged class, and then other people who work in the museum are from less privileged castes in the United States. So yes, this is it. The Empathetic Museum rubric asks us to look at some of these systemic things and see how we can disentangle them and not be beholden to them. So I think that's a really good contribution, Chris.
Thank you.
All right, any other people want to jump in with questions? There's nothing else new in the chat. I do have one I can throw out, but I'd rather anyone else go. Okay, so, jump in.
Okay, sorry. I was curious, and this kind of falls in line with what we're talking about, although it might not be as relevant right now with museums being closed. But something I have been really interested in is what I wrote my graduate thesis about and originally learned about the Empathetic Museum is more kind of emotional support and education and de-escalation tactics for visitor services staff and other folks working on the front line. And I am kind of curious, even though I know a lot of museums are closed, if you have, Gretchen, any thoughts about how that plays a role, especially now that museums are, rightfully starting to step up to be more anti-racist institutions, and how that impacts those people working on the front lines who interact with visitors who may have strong opinions or strong emotions about some of these topics.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a huge issue. I hope I can remember all the different thoughts that came to mind when you said that. But, I would say that, yes, certainly as people are being hired back and they're going to be on the front lines and, hopefully masked, and hopefully people coming into the museum masked, but still they're like grocery store workers or anybody that is going to be really in contact with the public, while many other museum folks will still be able to work from home or in the safety of their offices. And the other thing I think about trauma and self-care and thinking about the needs of people, I do think that is something that's missing and is a part of institutional empathy, that you're thinking about the pressures that people are under, especially those people that are being bombarded by students, or they're kind of out in the public sphere. And I also hear this a lot. I mean, this is something that I learned as a white person in museum culture, that I hear many colleagues of color who often are the only one in whatever their department, or they're a minority. And really the word that keeps coming up over and over and over again is trauma. That the pressure of kind of being the representative of your group, whatever it is, of being the one that everybody pivots to, if there's a question about Spanish, or about bilingualism, or about race, or whatever, it's very hard on people. And there's a lot of really frank discussion among, I think, particularly women of color who are predominant in a lot of museum settings, in education and so forth. It's really, really hard, and a lot burn out. And you see, they might not give a particular professional reason, but they leave. And so I think this is something that directors in particular, and heads of departments, really need to look at in their staff, and think about allowing for self-care, and allowing for people to talk about, well, what would self-care mean to this group, and how could we help with that? Every conference that I've gone to that's had to do with racial issues, like Museums and Race, or mass action, there's always been a corner kind of closed off with pillows on the floor, and there's often kind of like aromas and scents that people can just use, and you could go back there and you can take time out if things get to be too much in the discussion, and you can listen to music. And I mean, in all of those, the people who organize those are very aware of this, and they provided this for the people that come to those conferences, where there are going to be discussions that sometimes can be difficult.
Thank you. Margie's made a comment. Margie, did you want to take the mic and talk about this or elaborate on this, or did you want me to read it out?
Sure. I was just responding to Chris's comment, which I completely agree with, but I just wanted to offer maybe a little glimmer of hope that I actually see that the hierarchy in museum staff changing. It's a slow change, and I also see some backlash to the changing, but the curators, had a higher position in museums for centuries, because the emphasis was on collections and on objects, that were removed from their context. And now, of course, museums don't do that. They are working so hard to put everything in context, and to show multiple contexts, and to, really focus on the cultures that created the objects and the audiences that are consuming museums. So I think the hierarchy is really shifting, and there is a bigger emphasis on the educator, on the frontline people that have all of those skills that help bring museum collections and people together. So
Let's hope.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think most museums, that's what their goal is. That's what they're trying to do. But it's a long, like you say, Gretchen, all this kind of change takes a very long time. It doesn't happen overnight, or even
Right.
in a couple of years.
And also, again, here's a good example of body language. I do think you're right that, there are more educators on curatorial teams and that kind of thing. But look at what happened during the pandemic when push came to shove. Who are the majority of people who lost their jobs? It's just, I mean, it's unquestionable that who is valued are the people that take care of the collections. So this is where, again, if there's going to be a reboot, looking back at, okay, what was our knee-jerk response? What was the knee-jerk response of the museum field? And what does this say about our values? And then, you know, how do we shift this?
That's probably a good place to end. We're just at 2 o'clock and we promise to keep this to an hour. I thank you, Gretchen, and everyone who's attended. Thank you, Leigh, for managing this discussion so ably. And we hope that we'll see you again at the next session. Tomoko, did you have something?
Great. Yeah, just real quick, big thank you, underscoring what Ruth just said. Gretchen, this was a tremendously important conversation. And thank you for everyone who asked questions and everyone for participating. We have a very different kind of program next week, but I want to let you know that we have a session called Activate the Outdoors, and we hope that you will join us then as well. Thank you so much. Please be sure to check CAM's website for more information and to register for future ReMuseum virtual programs.